Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Sangeeta Datta. I am SAS woman of London. There are many others, of course. And I'm very pleased to be here at this time of the year when we've been missing regular lit fests and music events and all the sort of live events which brought friends and like-minded people together. So welcome to this very special afternoon when Prabha Khaitan Foundation brings back to you a live event on Authors Afternoon. As all of you know, Authors Afternoon is an initiative led by Prabha Khaitan Foundation as well as with Shree Cement Limited in association with Taj Bengal. You're probably also aware that Authors Afternoon and all the other literary events that PKF organizes have continued. They haven't really stopped. We've had a lot of virtual events and sessions right through the year. And I think a lot of that kept us alive, intellectually alive and connected. But it's great to be back here in a live space and to see all of you face to face. Again, as all of you are aware, with PKF, the literary events and the cultural events are all aimed at improving education, culture, art, literature. It's also about seeking gender equality, women's empowerment, and livelihood. The SR's group also is the group for women, and I feel very proud to see the manner in which these groups have literally grown through the years, through the months, and there are so many cities now where lit fests or lit events are organized by the women resident in those towns. They're not all cities, so it's a great way of, and a very democratic way of growing. It's my honor, and I'm very happy to welcome the guest author of today, Ms. Meha Dixit. Meha has been doing very interesting and very engaging work. She has a PhD, so you're not Miss, you're Dr. Meha Dixit. A PhD in international politics from Jawaharlal Nehru University. Her thesis, very interestingly, is titled Human Security and Post-Conflict Reintegration of Child Soldiers. Disarmament, demobilization, reintegration programs in Mozambique and Sierra Leone. She has worked with Amnesty International and Save the Children. She's also taught at Kashmir University. And here I'd also like to welcome our SAS woman of Kolkata, Esha Datta, who will be in conversation with Meha. I think we'll have time to bring in questions at the end of the session. Enjoy, and thank you, all the staff here from Taj, from PKF.
Thank you, Sangeeta. Very warm welcome to all our guests back for the first physical session of an Authors Afternoon, and this really feels good after all the almost a year-long virtual sessions that we've had, which were interesting in their own way. But I think a face-to-face interaction is always better and feels a little closer to normalcy. Speaking of normalcy, we'll be having a lot of that conversation, I think, during the course of this discussion. But welcome, Meha, welcome to Kolkata, and welcome to an Authors Afternoon. As Sangeeta introduced you, you chose a very unusual, different, and very interesting topic for your PhD. Tell us something about this choice of yours, about the reintegration of child soldiers, post-conflict.
Yeah, so basically, can you hear me? Am I audible? Yeah. So it was basically during my MA days when you had the Sri Lankan war raging, and wars in different parts of the world, including Africa, South Asia, Latin America. And I was really moved by the plight of child soldiers, and also the question of what happens once when the war ceases or the DDR, that is disarmament, demobilization and reintegration process takes place. Because a lot of them actually would have been abducted or had voluntarily or involuntarily taken up arms at a very young age. So apart from military skills, they really wouldn't have any other skills, no education to speak of. So the whole question of what really happens when this process goes on, what about their future, what about their lives, how are they able to reintegrate into societies, into community? So those were the questions which were going on in my mind, and I thought it was really important to look at those, to understand, and not just read about them, but given an opportunity, even travel to those areas, spend some time there, and to understand what really happens. So that was the basic idea, and I decided to work, to begin with, on the issue of children in armed conflict. So not just study, but even work as well.
So you spent almost a decade traveling for this book, for doing research for the book, and you traveled to, I think, all the conflict zones, post-conflict zones, and those are not easy areas to go to. So during the course of your travels, can you, and you can't pick, because I think this is a common denominator for war in general, that's pain, fear, and difficulty. But if you had to pick, what would be a difficult country or zone, a fearful one and a painful one? Like I said, it's a common denominator for war in general, but even if you had to choose, since you really covered a lot of area.
See, I can talk about the difficult area to work in, also as an individual, going alone, and also as a woman. You know, that makes it even more difficult in several ways. So, painful, I would say, since you asked this, painful, I would say, most have been painful. And all, in fact, I wouldn't even say most, but all have been painful in different ways. And I think that there would be no way to quantify it, because I feel suffering cannot really be quantified and measured. But as far as difficult areas concerned, I think I would say one of the most difficult has been Afghanistan. Also because it wasn't just Kabul I traveled to, it was various other provinces I traveled to. It was Kapisa, it was Parwan province, it was then, Bagram base, and also Nangarhar province, which is bordering Pakistan, and Landikot and Dorkham border, and also going towards Herat, where you have the Iran border, and like major Persian influence over there. So I would say that Afghanistan has been difficult, also as a woman to travel, because you can't really travel alone as such. It becomes very difficult, and I wasn't working with any organization. If you're working with UN, if you're working with several other international organizations, they're very strong protocols. So I would say I was lucky to not really have those protocols and actually be able to do my own thing. And also, very often I would have to, because in Afghanistan you have, even if you see journalists or correspondents, they will have their head covered and all of that.
So you went alone to all these places?
So, so I had to be accompanied by a local, a male preferably. And so I can talk about one instance, which is when I was traveling to the Pakistan border. And I'd decided to go to Nangarhar in Jalalabad, and which at that time was even now there is influence of ISIS, but not so much when I'd gone there. So Islamic State presence was very strong, especially in the road towards Achin, which goes, and so over there it was really strong, and in the Nangarhar province, and also Taliban. So parts of various areas have been captured by Taliban. For instance, Lagman province. So actually, to travel to Jalalabad, I had to cross Lagman, and initially I had decided to take a taxi, hire a personal taxi and go with a local, Ahmed. But I was staying with this local family, and they said, no, you shouldn't take a local taxi, a private taxi. It's better to travel in a sumo. So you have public sumos, right? Like shared sumo. So I said, all right, and then they're like, oh, you have to, and you'll have to wear the entire robe, and you'll have to, you have to cover yourself, and so that, it's like almost camouflaging yourself. Because some reason they're like, okay, you could pass off as, as an Afghan, so, you just wear that. And then there were like these guidelines which they'd given me, that you're not going to speak at all. And it was a journey of, I think, 4.5 hours. And they're like, you're not going to speak at all. If you want anything, So just through gestures, you convey to Ahmed. So I think it almost seemed that I'm mute, actually. The entire journey I was quiet and not just gestures and all, I was trying to communicate. And so finally we reached Jalalabad, and when I reached Jalalabad it was 4 o'clock, and I said, and there was this director of an NGO, I can't name him for security reasons of course. So he was really kind to facilitate the field trip. So, and because I had to travel to also the border, plus I was also doing interviews of the drug addicts there, Afghan drug addicts, a lot of them, because that's the major hub where a lot of meth, like synthetic meth, is coming in from Iran and places like that, and even from Pakistan, and even Afghanistan itself. It's a major producer of opium, of course, but synthetic meth is coming from there. So that drug issue I wanted to, focus on, and also the issue of Afghan returnees, because a lot of them had traveled, during the course of conflict. A lot of them had traveled to Pakistan as refugees, and many of them were returning at the time. So I wanted to interview them at the daycare center and also visit the border and visit, children or orphanages if I could. So now what happened, I reached, and then he said, so I said, can I, it's 4 o'clock, and of course I can't do interviews now, so can I just go and out, I can go out with them or then just to see the city. And so he said, no, you can't do that. He said, Jalalabad is on high security alert, and you're an Indian national, close to the Pakistan border, and there are a lot of Pakistani spies here, so you possibly cannot do that. So you stay put here, and whatever you want, you tell Ahmed. So anyway, Ahmed went and he came back. And so initially he didn't really agree for me to go to Pakistan border, he said, because, the spy. But later he agreed. I said, please let me go. I'll just do whatever you tell me, I'll dress the way you want me to. I'll be quiet and not utter a word and, camouflage myself. And so he said he finally agreed. And but the first issue was that what about, where am I going to stay? Because I can't stay in a hotel, because then I'll have to show my passport and my identity will be known, like I'm in India close to the Pakistan border. That was ruled out. Then guest house was ruled out.
These were all last minute decisions you were taking?
Yeah.
You didn't think of this before?
A lot of times I do that, I just go unplanned.
You're very brave.
I just go on, and this is one instance, even in Sierra Leone I'd gone like that. But, so, and then he's like, now would you, so then he said, okay, you stay in the training hall of the NGO. And I said, okay. So next few days I spent staying in the training hall. So there was a mattress and, just like a washroom. Yeah, so in that, so he said, you'll be safe here. And then it was, then
So
we
I'm not
traveled
going to ask the next part about the fearsome, because you obviously are very brave.
So
Nothing could
if there is time, if I can just add a little bit to it. So okay, so finally when we were traveling, and also not just the issue of where am I staying, but also not declaring my identity to anyone, even those I'm interviewing, because I had to go to the narcotics center, and I had to interview the director over there and a couple of other people, and they're like, okay, and they were actually discussing, you could be Nepali, you could be Bangladeshi.
So they never asked you?
No, they knew I'm Indian, but they were trying to decide that what identity, what nationality am I going to say that, I'm actually.
You went to meet them?
Yeah, when I would go to meet.
So you can't disclose your name?
I can't. He said, and we three of us, we're sitting inside the room, only three. It was like, that the whole spy feeling.
Like in a movie.
So he said, like the three of us, only we are aware that you're Indian.
Yeah.
Even, when you step outside the room, even the guard over there or the person at the reception shouldn't know that you're Indian. So it was like that. So anyway, and so we would, then next day we decided to travel to Ladikul and Torkham border. And as we were traveling, so there was one female doctor, one male doctor. I was sitting in the middle, and there was Ahmed. And Afghans love Indians. It's like the moment they know that you're Indian, and they're like, they're ready to kind of do anything. So, that great hospitality and all. So, and they're talking about Indians. And suddenly I said, I'm Indian. And Emma looked at me and he was like, I said, what? He said, you're not supposed to reveal your identity. Then, the doctor, the male doctor, he said, Aap chinta mat karo, in those...
So the fear was basically because you were in the border area, it's not from
they
the
could be
Afghan
spies.
locals.
Yeah, but they could be spies.
Yeah,
anyone
of
can
course.
be from any nationality, could be spy. So then he's like, "Aapka raaz hamare saath rahega." Aapka raaz hamare saath rahega. So that was one. I think it was quite difficult to travel.
I can imagine. My God, that sounds scary anyway. From where I'm sitting. Okay, so it's people form the subject of this book of yours, Piece of War. It's the humane aspect of war that you have really delved into. So what would you say are the coping mechanisms which the people you interacted with in these zones, what were the coping mechanisms they employed vis-a-vis what we under stressful conditions would employ, like you and me? We can go through strife, stress, whatever, but we'd handle it differently, obviously, because we are in a peaceful, civil world. So, because you brought up I'm just leaving it to you because I've read the book, and you brought up very interesting incidents about how they coped. There was music, art, so just tell us something about that.
Okay, so, because I have worked in conflict zones, but I also worked on issues like trafficking and even in slum areas, and I've done all of that, when I was working with Amnesty or even otherwise volunteering and issue of even I've come here so many times to research on cross-border trafficking. So, because and now, since I've not just looked at conflict zones, I've looked at conflict zones which are, of course, different from most other places, people are living in. And also having talk to people or work with people who are displaced for various reasons, not necessarily war, or simple ordinary people it could be. So I feel that people, even if you could be living in the most peaceful environment, but everyone has their own prisons, There are certain prisons. It could be a prison of poverty, it could be a prison of, it doesn't have to be physical, it doesn't have to be tangible always. So for instance, if I talk about Kashmir, so a lot of people I spoke to, they're like, Kashmir is a prison with, like armed forces all around, and when we walk outside and we have to keep proving our identity and all that. So that is one prison, but then of course even ordinary people with day-to-day life, they have their own prisons. So I would say that people there, I think, also employ very often similar kind of ways what people in other situations would employ. For instance, trying to be with a family, spending time with a family, trying to socialize whenever it's possible. Or, it could be creativity, writing poetry, or it could be music. It could be listening to music, or it could be playing an instrument, it could be singing, it could be sports. So various others which even people living in so-called peaceful, quote-unquote, peaceful environments would do. But I think the difference I would say is that, okay, there would be various prisons, but if you look at conflict zones, it is accentuated because then there's another prison of that, being in a militarized society. So that gets accentuated, but as far as coping, I would say, ordinary people, how they are using different means, that is how people also try to use different means. And if I can add dark humor, it's like something I mentioned in the book also, where people, when I'd gone to this Gurudwara in Kabul, and I was talking to members of the Sikh community, and I said, it's so difficult, like every other day, any time of the day, there could be suicide bombings. It's so frequent here. and so unpredictable. So he said, now these suicide bombings are like firecrackers. So it's also, it gives that sense of them using dark humor, of trying to cope with it in whatever way they can. Also even fatalism, I'm sorry to interrupt, but even fatalism, also people will say that, this is our fate, and this is how we are living. We are trying to live within that situation and what we can do best in that. And then again, every individual would cope differently and would have different capacity of coping and even resilience.
So which brings me to what you've mentioned in the book, that these war zones are actually like lands of, they are spaces of, there are a lot of contradiction. They're trying to normalize the violence. Like when you said, when they see this shelling and bombing and they're comparing it to fireworks, that in a way is actually trying to normalize the situation. They just got used to the sounds of war. So, do you think that kind of in a way impacts in the long run mental health of the people? Because they've just got used to, imagine if today we had bombing and shelling above our place, we wouldn't even look at it as firecrackers. So do you think that in the long run it has, you have said so, it does impact the mental health and of the people living in these areas?
See, but if, we had like bombing once, twice, thrice, maybe if it continues, then probably we would also start saying that, okay? But
So
as far as
used to it.
Getting used to it. So I think two aspects are really important and contradictory here, which over a decade of research, which I have learned from people in different conflict zones, is that a lot of people, when I would ask them, how do you cope, with the violence all around, injustice, suffering, and constant attacks, how do you deal? So, a lot of them, and this is across, I'm saying, they're like we're used to it. But in the same breath, many have told me that there's this fatigue which is set in. We're tired of it. So there is, in a sense, a contradiction, right? And I feel that there have been times when, because it's very, there have been cases where I haven't just met a certain individual once. I've actually followed up, and I've been meeting same individuals for years now. So I know people in different conflict zones whom I'm meeting. So there would be times when they would radiate so much hope and optimism, and the next minute, not next minute, but in some other situation at another point of time, they seem to be totally broken. Because I remember in Kabul there was this editor of a magazine, and what happened is I'd come back from Afghanistan, and this is 2016, and I was there. In 2017 I was back, and then there was a series of suicide bombings, and one day it was like I think multiple bombings. It was a major attack that day which happened. So I called up this friend who was editor-in-chief of some magazine over there, and I said, "Where are you?" So he said, "I'm at a restaurant, a Turkish restaurant, and just with my friends enjoying." I said, "Yeah, I heard that, about the suicide attack, and I was really worried about you and your family. Is everything okay?" And also because journalists are also targeted in Afghanistan. A lot of other places also, but in Afghanistan there has been a trend for a couple of years now. So he said, "Yeah, I mean that happens and that's happening, but we're not going to stop living because of that."
So that's the resilience you speak about also.
And also fatalism in a way, I mean, I wouldn't really call it so much to do with resilience, but then to come back to the same person, 2 years after this I spoke to him, and then he told me that, I'm getting a lot of anxiety. There was a bombing which happened, and after the conversation, when I'd gone there, he showed me there were cracks and all that in his office, couple of times office. So there were these cracks. He showed me because of the bombing, all that happened. And then he said that, I get a lot of anxiety these days, and I don't know how to cope with it. So it's the same person. It's the same person. So, sometimes it just lurks beneath the semblance of normalcy.
And You've spoken a lot in your book about women in war zones and conflict zones, and they are vulnerable, and they're also the targets of abuse. And you have mentioned here how sexual abuse is used as a strategy of war. It's not just a byproduct; it's also a strategy of war, which is quite horrific. So, what was your experience when you interacted with women? They were mostly confined to the homes; they didn't come out much, right?
So,
I'm talking about like active, like suppose in Kashmir, where it's like a long protracted war going on. I mean, there are spurts of violence off and on, but more or less women they can't lead their normal lives. They don't go out much, they're home, and yet they're the objects of abuse from time to time.
Yeah, so, okay, with Kashmir it's a little tricky here because firstly, it's such a political issue, and us being Indians, and so it gets so tricky because then you have the involvement of security forces, you have the involvement of Indian state, and there have been allegations and reports from since the 90s, early 90s, by human rights organizations of abuse or even systematic abuse by the security forces. So this is something even some women have spoken about with me. And there have been women who've said that we haven't experienced, but we have heard. Or there would be girls who would tell me in the cities that we hear about it often, and especially in the rural areas. In the city it may not be so much prevalent, but in the rural areas it's more prevalent. But also, there would be girls who would not be really comfortable talking about it, maybe about sexual abuse, because generally, even the talk of sexual abuse, even as an individual, as a woman, when you're on the street and when there's some kind of harassment, I haven't really seen women being so open about it. Of course, there are women who are vocal about things, but in general I'm saying. So, and of course even women go out to protest. If you look at Anchar, so it may not be so much as men over there because boys and men are essentially involved, but areas like South Kashmir, and this has been like early 90s, when you're looking at the exodus of the Kashmiri Pandits, that time when they left. So you had a lot of women protesters that time, early 90s. Downtown area mainly in Kashmir, and also rural areas. That time North Kashmir was essentially affected by militancy, and right now it's essentially the South Kashmir, many of you would know, is the hotbed of militancy. So yes, women do participate, women are really vocal, but as far as the issue of sexual abuse is concerned, I haven't really seen so much of conversation on it. There have been, like I said, human rights organizations have reported
supporting it, but you
a lot of and like personally, I haven't really come across any woman who's told me. They've told me that yes, there are instances, there have been reports, we've heard, so all of that, yes. And okay. Yeah. So and other situations, of course. I mean, if you're looking at Myanmar, for instance. The question of Rohingya refugees, where United Nations had documented that rape or sexual abuse has been used as a strategy, and which I've mentioned also in my book here. And but this whole thing of being rape or sexual abuse being used as a strategy of war, so it gained prominence essentially. Like it was brought out in the public realm. It was happening ever since the wars began, in fact.
Yeah.
Even mythologically, you see that women have been treated as spoils of war, right? So, but as far as the question of gaining, this issue gaining public prominence, it was in the early 1990s with Bosnia, the conflict going on over there. And then, of course, not just women, even men or boys are prone or vulnerable to sexual abuse. They may not be as vulnerable as women, but of course they are in different conflict situations. And there have been boys in Sierra Leone who were child soldiers, and they spoke to me about it. That we were abused, like girls, of course. Most of the girls spoke about it. I'd interviewed, I think, over 70 ex-child soldiers, and also a couple of ex-combatants in Sierra Leone. You might be familiar with the Blood Diamond, that film, right? So, yeah, so women and girls were essentially used as sex slaves there. So many girls, ex-child soldiers or ex-girl soldiers, they spoke about sexual abuse, that how they were gang raped, and really sad, very appalling stories, or their experience, not stories, but their experiences. But even boys spoke about it, that how they were sexually abused.
And what about children? You met with a lot of children also during the course of your book. You mentioned your interactions with children, young youth. And how did you find them dealing with war? In the different areas, not just Kashmir, everywhere. Right?
You mean youth?
Youth.
Or children
Children,
and youth, right?
Youth. Because you've mentioned about the importance of internet, basic food. I mean, there are little instances where that's again another coping mechanism, but it's interesting, how they are handling, because education has been severely impaired thanks to.
So are you? You're talking about different contexts.
The different areas. What has been your experience with the youth and these wartime zones, in the war zones?
Okay, so with youth, especially if you're looking at Kashmir, so youth have been at the forefront of the protests, of course. Young people, and also I've taught at Kashmir University, and so I had a lot of students who I interacted with. And this is during 2014. I was interacting with a lot of them, and they were really influenced by the whole the idea of Azadi and the protests, and willing out.
Part of the stone pelting that you've mentioned.
I know you. Okay, I should be saying this. I know youth who have participated in stone pelting.
Yeah, I mean that's.
Yeah.
We know that they do.
Yeah, they do. But what I'm trying to say, I know of.
Or you know of individuals
who have done that, but yeah. So who have done that, and I know of individuals who are also detained because of stone pelting and all of that. And also I think with war or conflict, there's also certain romanticism attached to it, and especially when it comes to youth. So with youth, I would say there are different aspects. First would be if there is a conflict happening, there is a conflict taking place, or is there in your area or your region, then of course you're not really able to study, or you're not really able to, even employment for young people, that's a challenge. So, how do you channelize that, right? So, I mean, that energy of the youth. So one is that, and not just channelizing, but it's just that, when you're not able to study, you're not able to get education, you're not able to get some kind of, you don't have job opportunities, you see injustice all around. So that also may compel you to take up arms or participate in protests, and especially when you're young, right? And because even when I was younger, then of course, we were part of the protest now, much more than I am now, right? I mean, it's not that I would not really go out for protest, but when you're younger, you're in college, you're doing your MA or you're studying, then you see more of that kind of participation by the youth. So I think one would be that aspect, lack of job opportunities, lack of education, or not being able to get proper education, and poverty can also be another factor, because also what happens is in different armed conflicts, Kashmir, because it's not a poor state, and people are relatively better off than a lot of other states in India. So it's a little different case, but when it comes to conflict. But if you're looking at conflict in different parts of the world, if you're looking at different South Asian conflicts, African conflicts, or even in Latin America, you see so much poverty, and you have these armed groups. They also lure, young people by saying that, we'll give you maybe food and shelter, and you'll be given some kind of remuneration, or you'll be paid something. And when you don't have any job, and so that's also, then young people would also, would want to participate and maybe take up arms. And then there's also this romantic idea of, wearing the uniform, excuse me, being part of a militia, and holding that gun, maybe AK-47 or whatever it is, different kind. In Africa, it's very often been machetes, which they have used. But yeah, so having a weapon with you, and maybe sometime you may just be promoted to the rank of a commander. So that's the charm, that's that incentive of. So there's so many different factors which come into it when you talk about youth and conflict zones.
So it's interesting, when we perceive the army as a protector, we equate the army with security, with sacrifice, and they look at the army with horror.
You're talking about Kashmir again?
I'm talking about Kashmir because there was there's this person who said, whenever we see them, we fear them, and we look at them with horror. There's a quote somewhere when I've written. Yeah, when I was a child, the sound of the boots and the uniform were symbols of horror to me. I mean, it's not ironic, it's because of the predicament they are in, but it's sad. Because this is, you said there is more fascination with them joining the militia rather than, thinking of protecting their borders or protecting. They don't look at it the way we do. So there is a very clear demarcation out there, which is, this is Kashmir specific. What about the other areas? What was your experience in the Rohingya camp?
So,
when you visited, it was quite horrific from the descriptions you've given in the book.
Okay, so, yeah, I know there was one moment where they were showing the videos, and I said, please, I just cannot see them anymore. So for the Rohingyas, so of course, essentially, see, again, it's a very tricky thing because, you have Rohingya, firstly the word Rohingya itself, Myanmar government doesn't really like to use that, and they call them Bengalis. So there's a lot of controversy even over the use of the term Rohingya. And also, there are Rohingyas, essentially most are Muslims, but there are some who are even Hindus. But again, some would say that they are not Hindu Rohingyas, they are essentially Hindu Bengalis. So it's a very tricky issue to understand in that sense. But I was in Cox's Bazar, and I was traveling to Teknaf and some other areas, and so there was this camp, when I went to Cox's Bazar, Kutupulang camp, which is like a huge sprawling camp and extremely crowded camp. So in Kutupulang camp, where you have a lot of them, the majority of them are Muslim Rohingyas. But there's a camp which comes way much before you enter the Muslim camp, is the Hindu camp. So essentially those Hindus, when I interacted with them, they said that, we fear the Muslim Rohingyas. So this is what they told me, right? That we fear because they told me, and I've mentioned this Chicken Chori village in part of the Arakan state, or Rakhine, which the Myanmar government calls it. So they said that because there is also this group, right, ARSA.
Yeah.
So ARSA is basically this militant group which has come up in recent times to talk about or to essentially fight for the cause of the Rohingya Muslims essentially. So that's the group, militant group, and what they had said that ARSA is, because of ARSA we had to flee. Many told me it's not because of the state we had to flee, but because of ARSA we had to flee. And they also told me that their villages were surrounded by the Arsa militants, and even some were even the local Rohingya Muslims. Now, so now it's very tricky to understand, because I have read reports and I've also followed a little on the stories of different local journalists who said that they're saying this out of fear. That essentially it was the government because they had to flee, and they're not really mentioning the government, and they have the green card, which the Rohingya Muslims do not have. These people, the Hindu Rohingyas. So there's a certain animosity which is there. So both the communities are kind of, especially Hindu Rohingyas, they say. But now it's very tricky to understand whether they fled because of Arsa, or whether they. Yeah, but Amnesty has actually mentioned about that, where Amnesty mentioned that they carried out this investigation, and where there were instances of Arsa being involved in the killing of Hindu Rohingyas and other minorities. So they did say that, but the local Rohingya, so it was a militant group, not the local, mostly not the the common Rohingya Muslims, maybe one or two, a few, whatever it may have been. But generally, so that is one aspect of it. Another aspect is that, of course, Rohingya with no citizenship rights, and they have been targeted, and we talked about women who have been sexually abused, and it's been used as a strategy, as documented by United Nations also. So their plight is, of course, it is very, very...
They belong to no country, basically. So
yeah.
Right now
they speak Bengali, right? So essentially, so the government says that they're actually Bengalis. And, they're not really Rohingyas or whatever. They call them Bengalis.
Belonging to Bangladesh.
Yeah. Right. So, and they don't want to go back. So now, a lot of them are there in Kutupulam, which is, then bordering the Myanmar border. And many of them I spoke to, they don't want to go back to, so unless their demands are met of, being able to get citizenship rights and, various other rights, basic human rights, which they say they don't have. So,
but the condition in these camps is pretty deplorable. So, the UN is funding these camps?
So basically you have, different...
like food, medical aid.
Yeah. So you have different organizations working. So it's not just the UN which is there. Okay. So you have, say, local. There's this one organization called BRAC, which is Bangladesh from there. Then you do have UNHCR, which is involved, and a couple of other international organizations which are there working, and for these kind of facilities, and also because they were not able to work. Because they have to, Rohingyas have to stay within that space. They cannot mingle with the community outside. They cannot mingle with the Bangladeshi community, and they could not work. So they were not really work. So they would work and they would get stipend essentially. Yeah. I'm not sure because I haven't been able to follow it up recently. I believe in the past few months, some rules have changed probably. But when I was there that time, they were not able to work or go to the same schools as the people of Bangladesh, and they had to stay confined to the camps. Be confined there and work. Yeah, they were informally working, but because I met few like this Zunun, I don't know how to pronounce that. So he said that he was working with some organization, but they had to leave, so they left the country. There's another person I spoke to. He said that he's working informally, he works and he gets some kind of stipend. So that's how they're able to kind of sustain.
Very quickly, we have time. Okay, just very quickly before we wrap up, I just want to know your experience in Lebanon. That is the only area I haven't touched on. We've done a lot of Kashmir and Afghanistan. What was your experience in Lebanon like?
Okay, so Lebanon, because I was interested in interacting with the people who've lived through the very difficult and prolonged war in the country. And so experience in general, or any specific?
Like your book, they'll all read the book, so
Okay,
the details
so
are there. So
general.
just tell me anything, any interesting anecdote, anything, an observation, any interaction which comes to mind.
Okay, yeah. So I think one maybe, I think which kind of sums it up, I'll talk about that. So the war began, it was I think 70s, and 1990 or 1991 was the Taif Agreement, where it was officially over. You know, skirmishes continued and all that. But see, it's been a long time, I mean, it's been many decades. But I met people and they said that, and not just those who've lived, especially of course those who've lived through the war, and also those who may be like daughters and sons. And you know, they would say that we feel, we're surrounded by, it's very volatile, that region, right? You have Syria, you have Palestine, then you have Israel, Palestine, and then you have, so basically these countries, you know, which are quite volatile. So one of them I remember meeting, and she said that it feels that war is at Lebanon's doorstep. So it's been a long time. So and you know, very interesting thing she told me that, you know, most Lebanese keep different nationalities, have different nationalities, many of them. So
They have to cross over.
So if suddenly something happens, you know, because, and especially with the Syrian war, where you had a large number of refugees coming into the country, and Jordan and Lebanon, they are host to the maximum number of Syrian refugees, and after that it's Turkey. So, and then there's more of paranoia, and also it brings back the memories of war. And they're like, we feel that it's at our doorstep. And many, I remember this Sabrina, okay, name changed. In the book she's called Sabrina. So she said that we feel it's just at the doorstep, and we Lebanese are just looking for an exit strategy. And so I've mentioned that in my book. So it's like, you know, okay, it's physical exit from the impending or a possibility of war, but it could also be, you know, exit from the anxiety of war. So,
Okay. So we now open it out to the audience. Any questions anyone has?
I can ask if nobody else wants.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Give us the mic. Give this. Am I loud enough?
You are, but you can just.
Thank you. Hi. So this was actually very informative, and you know, it actually took me back to a book which I had read on China, and when we were looking at this whole obsessiveness which the generation had with Mao, you know, and the whole thing. And as you were talking, it kind of drew me that do you, as a writer, feel you could compare the thing, you know, like about this whole youth being obsessed with the militia, you know? So is it more of a mental labor, or is it more of, you know, a mental prison which they are into, or is it just like to wield that power? Like, so what I remember of Mao is like that even if the parents were being hung on the road, the kids were more interested in watching him, you know, that was the obsessiveness with, you know, the power part of him. So the youth now in these conflict countries, do you think they are getting more and more attracted to it because of the power and the control which they've seen, which has been wielded over them, and they want to cross over to that side? Or is it just an inertia and a kind of, you know, a mental imprisonment which they are finding themselves unable to get out of? You know, with your first-hand experience, how would you like to compare the whole thing?
Okay. Thank you so much for the question. So I feel that that's all.
Yeah.
Okay. I feel that you know, with the youth, I wouldn't say it's uniform all the time, and even for one person there could be different aspects of it. So for an individual, I mean, there are youth who've told me that they've been attracted because, they were really fascinated. Or if I can talk of many ex-soldiers also I met, ex-child soldiers I met, or even those who are, who are living in conflict zones currently. They've told me that there is a fascination with grenades. So even in Kashmir, they said, we play with grenades, or we play with, the half-blown grenades and all that. So because I was talking about the whole romanticization of war and even weapons. Why is that? That a boy child is given a gun, right? So the whole idea of weapons, like a girl is basically given a Barbie or dolls, and then you have, and which is considered feminine. So I think it also goes back to that, different gender roles which you have, masculine and feminine, that dichotomy which is there.
The DNA of that, having that sense of control, so the weapon empowers them.
So that it could be one aspect.
Yeah.
I wouldn't say that that's
What's
it,
driving them? Yeah.
or I wouldn't say that, and that would be the same with all individuals. But romanticization is there, and also because, with kids you see, right? It's like, you're playing and, just the sound of the gun, or, you pull the trigger, and they're so fascinated with boys, especially, you see that. And that's been there ever since, I grew up. That's what I've seen children do. Even when I was a child, I would see my brother do that. So I think that is one aspect of it. And other thing would be, of course, weapons, even uniform, like I mentioned. Even the fascination with uniform. And also could be, I also mentioned about that someday you may be a commander. Like you're talking about power, control, right? And that also the hierarchical nature of being of an armed group, an armed militia, and you're reaching to that top level, yes, it's there. But also because of injustice. Also, they may feel that it could be perceived or it could be real. So that is another issue which could be discussed. So it could be because of injustice. It could be perceived or just real, or it could also be because of lack of opportunities. And that's the only way they feel that, they can maybe assert themselves. So it can also be because of they want to assert themselves, and sometimes they may feel that we're not being heard just by being peaceful. And we need to take up arms so that, people hear us. And that's the whole idea of terrorism, right? Why would you attack or hijack people? The idea is to draw attention. When you take responsibility that this is the armed group, and that, then the attention is drawn towards them. So also to highlight maybe their cause. So I would say there are different aspects, and it may not be uniform for everyone. And this is something I mentioned also in the book, where I interviewed many boys, of course, but I mentioned about two. So how two of them had similar experiences with the security forces, but their way of dealing with it was totally different. Their body language, their mannerisms, and their thinking process was totally different. So yeah, hope that answers your question.
I just wanted to ask you something about Lebanon, if possible, if we have the time. We traveled in Lebanon, I have. And did you also find that people were almost perplexed whether Christians or mostly Muslims, because they had come from this very westernized upbringing and background, and they couldn't understand the fundamentalism or the conservative approach that had suddenly been thrust into their midst. It's almost like a few Islamic fundamentalists were hijacking the way the world looked at the rest of the Muslims and judged them by those standards. Did you feel that in Lebanon? Because we seem to see that all the time with the people we were with.
When was it when you traveled to Lebanon?
In 2017, I think.
Okay, so I traveled in 2020, yeah. I think the Lebanese society, what I saw, is of course very diverse, right? So you have Maronite Christians, then you have Druze, Dirizi or something they call it, and then you have Shia Muslims, and then you have Sunni Muslims. So, of course, Lebanon, I feel, stands out in the Arab world because it seems to be a lot of Arabs and a lot of people, Muslims in different parts of the world I would meet would say that it's different. Even people in Kashmir. I remember talking to this one person in Kashmir, and he said, oh, Lebanon, it's too, it's too westernized, and they're not real Muslims. People over there. Those who are Muslims are not really real Muslims. So I remember one of them telling me that. So of course, it does stand out, and in that sense. But I think also with the war was also, it was so complex, and if you read about it, you would have read that how the entire city, Beirut, was divided into the Christian and the Muslim. So they have seen that radicalism or that kind of extremism even during that time.
It was almost entirely destroyed and built up again.
Yeah, so they have seen that. So I wouldn't say that totally they would be, it would be very difficult for them to take it because they themselves have seen it. And with even Shia extremism or even Sunni extremism, because I did travel to different parts. And you know what, Lebanon, I think if you are in where all did you travel to?
We went right up to Byblos, stopping on the way at a number of places. And what really upset me is they said you cannot go to Baalbek because it's too close to Syria. It's not safe, and you can't go to Tyre and Sidon either. So all the places that I really wanted to, it was a Friday when I wanted to go to Tyre and Sidon. They said no, it's too fundamental.
So I did go to a lot of places. I went to South Lebanon, and which is and the Bekaa Valley, which is a stronghold of Hezbollah, which is Shia extremists. And so I did travel to different parts. It wasn't just because Beirut is very cosmopolitan, right? You don't really feel that sense of radicalism or of extremism. It's a very cosmopolitan city, comparable to any, I think, world cities. I mean, it could be Paris, it could be London or New York, something like that. Pubs and Swiss cafes and all of that. But I had the opportunity to travel to different parts of the country. So it was, so I went to Tripoli also. So Tripoli, I remember when I told the driver that very cordial, nice taxi guy, I'm still in touch with him. So then he's like, oh, you want to go to Tripoli? Oh, they're poor people. This is how he spoke to me. So, but Tripoli is totally different. And you do see that it's a very, very different kind of a town. Then again, Baalbek is very different. So I would say that uniformity, even in terms of how people would perceive Muslims or extremism, I think that wouldn't be uniform in that sense. But yes, to conclude, I would say it does stand out as very different when compared to Arab world on the whole. Yeah, thank you.
That's it.
Meha and Aisha for this wonderful conversation. There were many questions springing to my mind, but maybe we'll carry on talking outside. This is a very complex sort of subject that you've looked at, and even conflict in every area has to be defined so separately. So it's yeah. And what made you interested in this, in just conflict areas? Because you're from Delhi.
No, I'm not.
We were all guessing you're from Delhi.
I don't know why I presumed.
I really don't have a sense of belonging to any place.
Okay.
I was born in Rajasthan.
Here. Let's get this. Give us 2 minutes for this. We've been talking to her for an hour. We need to know something about her background.
Okay, I was born in Udaipur in Rajasthan. I haven't stayed there for a very long time. I was in boarding then in Jaipur. And till 12th then, I moved to Delhi. I was in Delhi University. Dad was working abroad. He was in Saudi. And we would stay initially very close to the Yemen border. And travel to different then paths. And so it's been different paths. I think it's been Rajasthan, it's been Delhi, it's been Jaipur, it's been outside the country. So I really don't have a sense of belonging. I feel I belong to every place.
The last 10 years you've been going to very interesting
and I adapt.
places.
Thankfully, I adapt so easily. I'm just able to adapt.
That's interesting.
Yeah. So
That also makes you fearless and to be able to go to places without any plans. And that's quite daunting.
Absolutely.
Quite
Where will I stay tonight?
Yeah.
It's not something we'd ask ourselves when we are traveling.
I was telling Meha a little while ago because my younger son also has visited and done a lot of journalism in conflict zones. So every time she's speaking, the images are coming in front of me, whether it's Afghanistan or Lebanon or Egypt. His photographs are right in front of me as you're speaking.
Right.
So there are innumerable questions to ask, and the complexity of conflict itself, the sort of range of children that you might have been talking to, because youth is such a blanket word, really. There are young adults, there are very young children, and people get initiated into militancy at unbelievably young ages. So we could have another session sometime.
Yeah.
But anyway, thank you for this afternoon, for a very engrossing and engaging conversation. Thank you all for being here. I'd like to thank Prabha Khaitan Foundation, Shri Cement and Taj Hotel for their wonderful hospitality, and for this very unique experience that we have of boutique literary sessions here in the chamber. We started with Authors Afternoon, and then there are many different avatars now through PKF. Yes, and I'd like to request Mr. Farhan from the Taj Hotel Group to felicitate Meha.
Yes, sir.
Alright, let me come down. Yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you so much. It's lovely.
Oh, the girl with books.
Lovely. Yeah.
And I love that very languorous way she has of lying down and reading the
yeah.
book.
Is there a typical habitat for
Yeah, but it's like a yoga posture.
So, these are some books.
Yeah, so you sign. I think you all can come up and collect a copy of your books. Meha can sign this.
one person, I mean.
We'll go, just do it one at a time, row by row, so we can start with the first row. Yeah, yeah.